to the Where People Meet podcast, the event technology podcast for the worldwide meetings and events industry. I'm your host, Mitch Malinsky, head of sales here at Feedloop in beautiful and sunny Toronto. And today I am joined by a dear friend and colleague, Danielle Lamothe, Vice President of Learning and Innovation at the Canadian Society of Association Executives, also known as the CSAE. Now, I'm really excited for the conversation today. Danielle brings a wealth of experience to the table, having well over a decade under her belt in the association and membership industry. She has been lending her expertise to the CSAE for the past 8 years, and currently she spearheads the continuous improvements of their learning offerings. So Danielle, thank you for joining us today. Where are you calling in from?
I am also joining you from Toronto, the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Nice to be here.
Yes, incredibly well said. Thank you for adding that. If you're okay with it, I'd just like to dive in. Let's hit the ground running. If you wouldn't mind starting and telling everyone a bit about yourself and your background in the meetings and events industry, I think that would be a great place for us to start.
For sure. So I think the first place to start is I have spent my whole career in adult education. So I think of myself first and foremost as a learning professional. And I think a big part of delivering learning to adults is making it really easy. So I do think the meetings and events component is just a really nice way to deliver learning, but I always approach meetings from that learning lens first. That's just how I've approached it. And I have spent my whole career in adult education, and starting very early as in the tech sector, where I did published books and DVDs to teach people how to use, which buttons to click.
Yep. Amazing. Yeah. So you've dedicated your career to adult education. So instead of going the typical route of, say, a teacher or a professor, you've been spending a good chunk of your career working in the membership space. So why did you decide to go in that direction, and what sucked you in?
Well, I think like a lot of nonprofit professionals, it was kind of an accident of life. I had a baby and I did not want to go back into the tech sector because the travel demands just struck me as too onerous with a little one at home. So I took this maternity leave replacement in the association sector and have never looked back, and just really found it to be a very gratifying place to work because I focus on adult learning, and associations are focused on a profession or a specific industry. It's just a really tangible way to support people working in that profession, and I get a lot of validation from that. So once I entered that association space, it really felt like I'd found a home. So I've worked for different associations, but always in this aspect of trying to deliver the types of resources that people need to do a good job as adults, where we don't have time maybe to take a full university course or drop everything and go back to school. Sometimes you just really need something quickly, and I find that really fun to figure out.
It seems to be a fantastic fit as well. Like, we work with a lot of associations here at Feedloop, and oftentimes a cornerstone of their offering, their revenue model, is education, continuous improvement and learning, whether that be through workshops, events, content, and newsletters that they provide people access to. So I can definitely see the alignment there.
Yeah.
Now, you're currently lending your skills to the CSAE, and I'm very familiar with it. I know quite a few of our listeners are familiar with the Canadian Society of Association Executives. But for those who in the audience who aren't yet familiar with the CSAE, can you give us an overview?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is we are the Canadian National Nonprofit Professional Association for people who work in associations. So it's a bit circular. We consider ourselves the Association of Associations.
Yep.
So we deliver resources, knowledge, and the environment to help people strive in their own associations. So it's really fun because the people we work with also do our jobs in some capacity. So there's a deep understanding of what's happening, which sometimes doesn't work in your favor. But when people are like, well, when I plan an event, this doesn't happen. And you're like, I know it does. Yeah.
Amazing. And then specifically at the CSAE, your role is the VP of Learning and
Yeah.
Innovation. So what does that entail?
Yeah, so basically responsibility for the learning offerings that CSAE develops for our members. And that can be everything from, a 30 to 45-minute webinar to a multi-course professional designation, which is the Certified Association designation, which I hold. And I encourage people to check out if they're tied to the association space. It's very helpful.
Yep.
So really just trying to understand what our members need and then finding the best way to deliver that. So, because our audience are the executives, so CEOs, executive directors, senior leaders, directors, like just the people who have the responsibility of that association, their time is precious. Sometimes that's a conference, 3 days. You can cover a lot of topics and they can learn from each other. Because in this role, you tend to be the only person in your association who does what you do. You don't necessarily have, 6 sales support people who can lean on each other and
Yep.
strategize. You really have to look outward to someone else who might do your job. So that's where we come in and we try to connect you with those people and provide those resources.
That's great. And
Yeah.
I know you mentioned your approach is around delivering the various learning offerings to
Yep.
these executives. Do you find there is one learning offering that gets a lot more traction than others, or does it really depend on the content that is being conveyed?
It really depends on the content and the unique, we've developed a really robust tool called the Competencies for Association Executives. And
Okay.
so it's basically a breakdown of what are the different things that people need to be mindful of when they're running an association. But we're really careful in sharing that document to say, every association is unique. Every budget is different. Every size of staff is different. The maturity of your board, the professionalism of your board, these are all factors that mean there's no one perfect solution. We like to talk about best practices in adult learning and
Yep.
what other people are doing, but a best practice for, an association run by a staff of 1 is going to be completely different from the best practice for an association with 250 staff. So
Right.
it's really a very scalable role. So it really depends. The conference is a really popular offering because it lets
Mhm.
people find and meet people and have these conversations that, I'm not supposed to say this as the person responsible for the learning agenda, but sometimes it's the conversation you're going to have at lunch that's going to be worth the price of admission, because you're going to
Right.
talk to someone and find that solution that's just been elusive for 6 months because you can't figure it out. And then they share what they've just done. So it really depends. We have offerings like the CEO Symposium, which is an event that we run every year, and we have members who have been coming for 12 years and they
Oh,
don't
wow.
miss it. So it's an opportunity for a CEO and their board chair to sit down and really figure out how are we going to work productively together, because that's a really critical relationship. And then we have something like a governance forum, which allows an association leader to bring their entire board in. So that might be really valuable if you don't have the most mature board. They don't really understand the difference between what's governance, what's operations. And so that creates a lot of tension. So you do this event, you bring your whole board together, and then everybody understands, hey, this is the boundary. This is where strategy stops, and I have to let the staff do it. So it's really a very mixed offering, as it should be,
Yep.
because every association is different.
And one of the takeaways I'm getting here is like it's all context dependent. It
Yeah.
depends on who the audience is, it depends on their association, the size and structure of it. So that
Yeah.
helps to really highlight for the
Yeah.
audience here.
Yeah.
One item I would like to dive into in greater detail, if possible,
Sure.
is the concept of the competencies for association executives. I know this was an initiative that you spearheaded and put a lot of work into. So can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, for sure. So the CAE, the Certified Association Executive designation, has existed in Canada for 40 years, and it is a really valuable, it's a very unique piece of our offering. It's very precious to us, and it's kind of sacred for the association and our members. But it's a 40-year-old designation, and you have to keep looking at, what are the best practices in adult education. So in order to keep developing the program, we realized when I joined, I had come from an association that focused on training and development and learning and development. So in talking to some of the people who were instructing, people who were taking the program, I could see places where we had room for improvement, but it's hard to do that when you're editing a book. It's easier when you're looking at it and saying, oh, these are the priorities. This is what we really need to focus on. So the competencies were redeveloped, and now we're working on aligning the courses to the new competency structure. But beyond the value that they provide in the courses, it's just a really helpful tool. So we encourage people to use them when you're discussing priorities with your board, because the board knows a very little bit about what the actual job of running an association is. So those competencies can really help you sit down with your board and say, hey, look, this is all the stuff that's going to happen this year. This is what I suggest we focus on. And then that's a conversation that they can have with their board using a really tangible resource, instead of trying to say, our database isn't working right now. You can say, this is how that data flows through, and you can show them a real picture. So the competencies on their own are a really useful tool. They really help us also, when we're doing a call for proposals to speak at an upcoming event, the competencies are a useful tool for the speaker to see, oh, where do I fit in this context? Or what are the topics that are most relevant? Or if I'm a consultant and I'm telling a story, if I look to the competencies, I can see how to make it most relevant for the people who are going to be in that room. Because HR is HR, right? We know that, but an understanding of the unique realities of a volunteer and a paid workforce is maybe different, right? If you do a lot of HR speaking in the for-profit and private sector, you don't think of volunteers as a part of the workforce and what that recruitment and retention needs to look like. But you look at the competencies and you get that clear sense, so you don't walk in just missing a whole part of the picture. So we think they're a really helpful, useful tool in a lot of ways.
Yep. And I'm not sure if you are able to, but can you give us an example of what one of these competencies would be?
Sure, yeah. So the competencies are structured into 5 different competency areas. And we have a beautiful little wheel, but so the thing that wraps around everything, the part that governs really how you do, is the governance piece. So that's one competency area. So that includes everything from, what are your bylaws? How do you recruit your board? How do you look at what competencies are required on your board? What's your strategic plan? What's your risk management strategy? Everything that really says who you're doing things for and how you're going to do them, that's governance. And then you've got things like leading people, which I mentioned, managing operations, like what technology are you using? How do you manage that cash flow over the year? There's another competency focused on annual planning. So what is that year going to look like, and how do you set in place to make sure you've got the resources, financial and human, to achieve all of those objectives? And then at the very center of the competency structure, and the most important piece, is really delivering value to members. And that's, where all of my work is focused. And what do we actually offer them? How do we do all of the things that the other competency areas focus on? So
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it's clear that we could have a podcast recording just dedicated to that.
Yeah.
Exactly. But that's not what we're focusing on today. No. So if people do want to learn more about the competencies for association executives, where can we direct them?
Just come to the CSAE website, click on the CAE program, and you'll see the competencies right there.
Amazing. All right. Yeah. We'll be sure to do that in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right, so getting back on track here.
Yeah.
Now, working at the CSAE, in your words, representing the Association of Associations, I think that you clearly have authority to speak on a number of different topics pertaining to associations and membership organizations. What I'd like to pick your brain on, Danielle, is the latest topics and trends that you're seeing
Yeah.
are impacting the association industry, whether they're good, whether they're bad, or are you able to share some of the
Yeah.
trends that you've made note of?
Sure, yeah, and I can say the first thing that's starting off a little bit encouraging is 2023 is definitely shaping up to be a better year than I would say 2022 was. What we saw last year was a real discrepancy in the appetite to be back in person
Okay.
between, for us anyway, from the association executive who was going there to learn and the business individual who was going there to sell. And these are two really critical parts of the success of a conference. And so what we saw last year was a lot more appetite on the business side to be back in person, which, you know, is a huge challenge across the board, because if the people aren't there to be sold to, then the business people aren't happy. And if there are too many of them, then the association people who are there to learn feel a little bit embattled, like I'm being
Right.
pitched at constantly. So that was a factor last year, but we're seeing this year really, I'm really happy to say that we're seeing a lot less of that this year, and more of an appetite to be back in person on both sides.
Yeah.
But we're facing within that context still some of the challenges that impacted us last year, like these really serious sort of systemic challenges for the whole industry, which is the rising costs of labor. Um, a lot of associations, it was kind of good during the pandemic because we had all those wage subsidies, but of course those went away last year, and the economy is not great. So these lower budgets are affecting everyone. And there's just some things that we realized, I think a lot of us last year realized, like this hope of this hybrid event. We all felt responsible for doing it in 2022. And I think a lot of us realized there's no financially viable way to do this well and offer
Mhm.
both things at the same time. So, and also, the changing member needs, like some of the things that we did in the past, just like small one hour events at a hotel, that's really, really challenging to make financially viable this year. So
Right.
there's a lot of need to sort of keep assessing, well, what do our members really want? What are they willing to pay for? And how do we offer that sort of suite of products so that we're meeting those needs where they are? So it's a
Yeah.
lot.
And that last example that you gave there, the 1 hour meeting at a
Yeah.
hotel, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're cutting that out, but it might just be taking it and putting it in a new format, delivering it in a different way. So would that type of event now be run virtually, or what has your team done?
Well, so what we really do is we really take a look at what it is we're offering, why we're
Mhm.
offering it, who's going to come, and what they're telling us. So we used to do a lot of not virtual, sorry, in-person network, CEOs getting together to have a conversation in Ottawa.
Yep.
And there's so many factors that are affecting whether or not people want to come to that right now. And a lot of it is a lot of people are working remotely. So it's not like when you were in your office and you went to lunch down the street at the
Yep.
closest hotel. Now you're like at your home in Barhaven and you're like, well, I don't want to drive downtown and hit traffic. Or in Toronto, you're like in Pickering because you moved to a place where you could afford your house and now you're not coming into the city anymore. So
Yep.
a lot of that has to be weighed, and that doesn't mean we're not doing those things, but we just have to assess, and we can't keep doing things exactly the way we did them 4 years ago because the world is different.
The
So we
times
still
have
do some
changed.
of that,
Yep.
but we try to think, okay, are these people connecting on a geographical basis, or are they connecting on a specific issue? And if they're connecting on a specific issue, then the medium isn't as important, right? As long as we're providing the space for them to do that. And sometimes the virtual space is the way to go. And we had an event, the Governance Forum, which is a one-day training workshop that we did in person in the past, and it requires you to bring like almost your entire board together. So
Mhm.
of course, when the pandemic hit, we had to pivot on that one and make it virtual, and it was amazing. and people really loved it. And we saw that if we charged one price for a Zoom room for this offering and kept it virtual, it suddenly became this really accessible governance training for associations that never would have been able to justify the costs of flying aboard from across the
Right.
country, the hotel rooms, the dinners that they were going to have. And of course, that offering is different, but we now realize, well, that is a really solid offering for a specific type of association. And we have to keep that virtual. So there's this adjustment of constant adjustment, and what it looks like this year is not what it's going to look like next year. So yeah, it's a lot of. I really think with member service delivery, it's really about that constant check-in. Did you like it? What can we improve? How can we make your experience better? What were the barriers? And then trying to remove as many of those as you can.
So there was a lot in there.
Yeah.
If I may, I'd just like to quickly recap some of the takeaways that I highlighted for myself, and hopefully we can convey that to the audience in a clear manner. But lots going on in the industry, especially over the past few years, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic and now coming out of that. 2022, we saw a lot of associations trying to deliver hybrid events because that is just what they thought was to be expected. It seems this year we're not seeing as many hybrid events, but we are seeing some positive changes.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot more attendees getting back on site to these events instead of it just being majority buy side and the few attendees who are there being a little overwhelmed. At the same time, we're seeing some challenges, things like the rising cost from suppliers, labor, we're seeing cut budgets. So there's a lot going on in the industry, and member needs, member preferences, they're also changing. So to put it in your words, it's all about finding the right balance and trying to figure out what is the best education strategy, what is the best governance model that our association is going to employ in order for us to deliver value to our members. Do you think that's a good way to summarize everything that you mentioned there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I don't want to belittle the challenges, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about them, but because I think there's some significant challenges within this industry, the meeting event industry, that we're all going to have to look at, because these rising costs of labor, the supply chain issues that we've seen over the past few years, the consolidation of a lot of companies and the lack of competition, these are really big challenges, and they're forcing all of us to sort of adjust and adapt and change what our offering looks like. And that's regardless of whether you're in the nonprofit sector or not. It's just, it is a challenging time from a planner perspective, for sure. For sure.
Okay. Yeah. So let's dive into that, if we may. Sure. I know your team has been facing these challenges as well. Yeah. So what are some of the strategies that you've employed in order to run a successful event with limited resources? And what tips do you have for event planners who are facing the same challenges?
Well, for us, and we're in an evolution, so some things didn't work last year. So we've earned these lessons quite painfully, I would say. But I think some of the structures that we face, like we've gone remote, so we're not in an office anymore. So we're planning things with a lot of key players, and we have to divide and conquer because, we're recruiting speakers for a fall conference and a summer event at the same time. We've got, you're at the different phase in planning for a bunch of different events all the time. So what we've found is really to working very creatively and collaboratively with everyone on the team. So we work really closely with our sponsors to figure out what are meaningful activations. How do we make that experience unique and special to them and their brand? Yep. And the first couple of years we switched that strategy, it was a little bit challenging for all of us, right? Because it demands a lot more from everyone. But this year we just had our summer summit in July, and it was really exciting to sort of see that kind of thing come together. But on the like just team planning side, a lot of it is that creativity, that constant, keeping a really close eye on budgets and what costs are rising, and being really nimble and flexible as you move forward, and using some tools to help you. Like we've moved to something like ClickUp. So we use, virtual project management tools so we can keep everybody moving forward on all these various events at one time. That's really important. Frequent communication is the key. Communications with internally to make sure where everything's on board, communication with your partners, and to make sure everyone has that same expectation. Because once you start to get creative, it's like everyone's interpretation can be a factor. So you just really have to make sure everyone's on the same page. And I mean, have fun, right? It's a people industry, and we're doing this because we want people to feel a certain way when they come into our space and when they walk away from it. So I think you have to have that spirit throughout that whole cycle. Like we have a lot of fun planning these events. I mean, that doesn't mean we
Yep.
don't cry in the night or think, why do I do events every single end of conference? We look at each other and say, why do we do this? Why do we do
Yep.
this? But it's because ultimately we do have a lot of fun. So, and we try to remind ourselves that in the moments that aren't so much fun.
Absolutely. So lots of challenges impacting the industry.
Yeah.
Association executives need to be nimble. They need to adjust their strategy in order to adapt and persevere going forward. And I think that really speaks to the necessity of the work that you do.
Yeah.
Continuous learning for adults, continuous education for adults. For the listeners who have not yet looked into the CSAE or their competencies for association executives, I strongly recommend you do so, because it can really help you to just adopt that mindset and learn new strategies, make new connections with people in the industry who can help you to navigate these challenges going forward. So we've talked a lot about challenges in the industry. I would like to cap off on a positive note. So Danielle, looking ahead, what gets you excited about the association industry? Are there any positive trends that you're seeing? Anything that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I think one thing that's exciting about working in a giving profession and in the nonprofit sector is we're doing this, to help ultimately Canadian society, right? These associations are they're doctors, they're physiotherapists, they're dental hygienists. And if they're doing a better job, everyone's having a better experience. So that feels really great. And I think in terms of that continuous improvement spirit, which is really the foundation of the CAE program and all of our philosophy at CSAE, is just don't be afraid to try new things. Like not everything is going to be a success, and it's okay to fail sometimes, because if you don't try it, then you don't have the data that helps you build on something. Like some of our good stuff comes from failure, right? Like that didn't work, but let's try, or that speaker canceled at the last minute and then we had to find someone good and that person was great. And like you have to be able to look at things and say, I'm not going to be afraid to try something, because the thing that you try might be hugely successful. And if not, well, you'll have a funny story for the post event lobby bar debrief.
It's the brilliance of the growth mindset. I love that. This is a really good way to cap off the podcast. So thank you, Danielle. I really appreciate the time today. And I imagine some listeners might want to connect with you, possibly have a conversation, take you out for a coffee, pick your brain. If any of the listeners in the audience want to learn more about your work or connect with you, what is the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, reach out. I'm Danielle at CSAE.com. Our website is CSAE.com. And there's a wealth of information there, and always happy to talk.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get all of that in the show notes. Again, Danielle, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
I really enjoyed this. But to our listeners, I hope you found this conversation to be as insightful and as fun as I did. Thanks for your time today, and we'll see you next time on the Where People Meet podcast.
Ciao.